Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout 3 for Aimee, Daniel, and Nahrya. And I wanted to start by saying that I did enjoy your discussion, and you had an in-depth coverage of topics. Obviously each group selected to do a different approach to that exercise. And so I did like the approach you took. The only thing that I would have recommended is to have some sort of because of situational awareness for those of you that might have not been very well familiar with the area, or for anybody not familiar with the area, any visual presentation of a route or geographic surrounding areas and bringing it up would have been nice. Few groups did that, and that was very helpful to focus your activities or focus your attention on that. And one thing for Daniel, I think, and some of the instances, we tend to have that gender bias in incident command, or talking about the incident commander as a guy. I caution you that there are excellent incident commanders that have been female, so be careful in your writing and as well in the speaking when you talk about incident command or that emergency response, that you are gender sensitive. So the scenario that you selected was the same one as everybody else, scenario 12 with improvised explosive devices. And particularly because we do have a previous event from Boston Marathon bombing, you also considered VBIED, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, which certainly has been the mode of operating of hostile actors in other parts of the world. To take an instance of Nice, France, or Spain on Las Ramblas, or even the German Christmas market a few years back. So certainly a lot of considerations for planning. And I wasn't sure if you also included suicide bombing. So with that, for planning considerations, I want you to keep one thing in mind that I don't think was a big topic of a discussion, but we have not, to date, in the United States, had a suicide bomber. So that would probably for us be a black swan, or at least the event that is going to question that recognition prime decision-making model and the experience of incident commanders or decision makers, policy makers, federal entities, or anybody involved. This event would bring a paradigm shift in emergency management in the United States. So with that, planning considerations certainly, or would certainly be amplified, but by that dimension of international attention that this event would bring, and also the psychological impact for which, with the exception of recent war veterans that might have witnessed those events, most of the American public have not dealt with an event like that. So for all your psychological impact considerations, that would be one of them as well. And I don't think the national planning scenarios specifically speak to that. So the map would have been nice, but you did discuss the geographical conditioning for this event with the Memorial and Island Parkway, I-10, 59, 45, tall buildings, open parks, availability of eyes on the crowd using snipers on the roofs, and congregation of volunteers, obstruction, cell reception, the effects of that event on potential air support in the downtown area, certainly with the flights in that area are or could be challenging. Reminding you about the 9/11 and the helicopters not being able to do rescues like that did in 1990, and that was a big issue there, that a lot of public were still remembering those rescues from the rooftops from 1993 that were not possible in 9/11. So again, in the Houston area, certainly a consideration for the air support. You spent some time talking about preparedness, a planning consideration for hardening security in the area, particularly with respect to for vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. You discussed that New York City is a good example of them, using sand trucks, sanitation trucks that they do, for those big events in New York in preparation. You talked about Jersey Wells. You talk about using the in pre-planning, certainly the canine units, sweeps for prevention and deterrence. So with 250,000 spectators, you discussed the establishment of the hot zone with the fact that you have 10,000 runners and also, surrounding crowds. So the movement issue, displaced population. So when you recall the characteristics of successful incident commanders dealing with huge displacement impact and economical impact, that certainly would affect decision making here, as the scenario tells you that would be approximately 200 immediately affected, about 1,000 people seeking help in hospitals, and anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 people displaced, needing shelter and some type of isolation. You looked at medical capacity. Houston is very specific in that respect, but it is the largest medical center in the world, Texas Medical Center, which is good and bad. Good because you do have a huge healthcare presence and capability and capacity. But at the same time, if you have staggered events involving suicide bombers and vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, if those medical capabilities are damaged, then the reliance of most of the Houston area is certainly on Houston and the resources that are available there. So this could, in this event, be a reverse factor where mutual aid is needed from the outside hospital capability. And those entities like St. Joseph for burn trauma, to Bentel for being a county facility, or Memorial Hermann with life flight capability, those could be compromised. So just to add to that medical capability, I want to talk to you about the structure that does exist in Houston. It is called its multi-agency coordination structure. So if you recall NIMS, the National Response Framework, it's a MAC, and that's Catastrophic Medical Operations Center, CMOC, that coordinates different healthcare corridors in the area, and they share information on availability of beds, on evacuations, on resources available, on decisions that they are making. And they would coordinate through Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, Houston Emergency Center, and C-TRAC. So certainly that would be part of the planning consideration of having them involved in the planning process for that event. So yes, you did mention about those medical facilities being affected and how they are all connected. Certainly, the impact on one could have had cascading events on the others, and then there will be a strong reliance on CMOC to coordinate that. When you talked about, you did discuss the firefighters at the perimeters and some of the capabilities such as victim care, investigations, recovery, pastoral services or chaplaincy services. I think Daniel had a really good discussion on that, and Aimee talked about, you know, how some of those would not be certainly involved in immediate response. You mentioned the casualty 01 of 9/11 being a chaplain. There's a quite impactful picture of him being the first victim that made the news. And certainly when you talk about that, I want to bring you to the emergency management component. Emergency management coordinates this whole event with emergency responders working it. So counseling services would have to be part of the planning with a special consideration where that would happen. So what areas, what facilities, what kind of points of counseling would be established so that you could in fact direct those resources, counseling resources, not in a hot zone and not having them in a hot zone, but having them in a particularly pre-designated area, be it a faith facility, churches, places like that. So that certainly should be part of pre-planning for any major event in Houston. Certainly triage, walking wounded, I think you talked about, and I don't know if your group talked about that, but in triaging, certainly walking wounded are not a primary consideration in triage, but certainly they have to have proper communications. There's going to be a communication plan. Those people are going to be working in conditions of very limited audio, visual capabilities. There's tinnitus, there's noise, there's shell shock, with this type of events. So proper management of those groups of people would be critical. But for triage, obviously, is your red labeled people, the ones that require medical attention immediately within the first hour, would be the preoccupation of the emergency management component here. So triaging and establishing where the triage is certainly outside of a hot zone, and if you have a contamination of any sort, like in the movie Dirty War, would be outside of the warm zone. So you do not have people that are triaged in actually contamination area, because that would be a tremendous detriment to medical capability, those ambulances being contaminated and things like that. I think Aimee was talking a lot about media being present during that parade. It's highly televised. It's a yearly event. It's a huge event, as you know, 250,000 plus spectators. So their planning considerations certainly would be how to manage the media message. And this would happen from the emergency management standpoint by activating joint information system. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be the international attention event. And it is going to also be an event that's going to trigger presidential declarations and also federal investigations, with the FBI being under the Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5. FBI would be a lead investigator on the terrorist activity and coordinating with local law enforcement. So two things are going to happen. A joint field office would have to be established, which is that temporary federal facility where coordination to the local law enforcement is happening. That would most likely be established at the field office for the FBI in Houston. And there would also be a Joint Information Center established. So Joint Information Center is a pre-designated facility in Houston area. It's at the Harris County Office of Emergency Management, Homeland Security and Emergency Management, where the TranStar is also co-located. So the Joint Information Center is a facility that has all the communications, but also has pre-designated positions for major public information communication officers from different agencies, representatives from news media, representatives from, for example, Coast Guard, because they do have Coast Guard has a great capability for situational awareness with their aviation capabilities. So those people sit there, and in addition to them sort of crafting a uniform message within the unified command, there is a media monitoring, rumor control, and social media monitoring entities. So those aspects of communications would happen at the much more emergency management coordinating level. So people who scan the news look for any inconsistencies, make sure that the important information that was released to the media outlets is actually disseminated through the use of whether it be text messaging or public broadcasting or emergency alert systems. And that group would also make sure that, all their international outlets or foreign language needs are being met for dissemination of information clearly. With Houston having 140 plus languages as far as linguistic diversity of people that just live there, not to mention all the tourists, small agencies or smaller agencies cannot afford those type of services. So this is a purpose of Joint Information Center within the Joint Information System, where they would have those lists of translators or people that would be helping if there are special populations of interest that need that language expertise or releasing the information in their language. And then social media. Certainly, looking at the tweets, I think Aimee mentioned different platforms that are available for scanning stuff. I think you mentioned that, you were at the scene and, it hit the social media, your picture was there. The social media monitoring at Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, tags the hashtags, for any suspicious activity or some kind of spontaneous resulting action that can come about, as well as information gathering, and as well as making sure that all those different entities like the PIOs for Metro and STEP are getting the same information. So social media monitoring as a function exists at the emergency management level for this event, and that definitely would be a planning consideration. Certainly, Aimee being, very well familiar with the area and working as a first responder in Houston brought about the ramifications of criminal investigations. This potentially with staggered events is going to be a huge crime scene. It's going to move way into short-term recovery for conducting investigations. Those investigations, particularly because we haven't had those events in the past. Israelis deal with it totally differently. The Israelis clear the suicide scenes within hours. That links to their adaptability and building capacity for societal resilience, so people sort of move on. We have not built up that capability because of lack of exposure. So certainly for criminal investigation is going to be a new paradigm as well, dealing with those type of issues. Obviously, Boston Marathon bombing was the blast scene with shrapnel and all those different injuries, with hospitals having to know what to do in those cases, particularly to support criminal investigations, so that evidence is preserved as the patients are being admitted to the hospitals. Here you're going to have a biohazard because you have suicide bombers. Obviously, there are going to be other issues to consider, DNA testing and things like that. So very, very critical in planning considerations on setting up, and establishing how that is going to happen, and what law enforcement agencies and, forensics, being the main examiner from Houston for forensic investigations, how they would be involved. So when you talked about, I think there was, you were trying to find the terms for those hot zones, warm zones, and cold zones. And yes, this is a nomenclature that is used in emergency management today. Hot zone would be the immediate threat and ongoing threat area where you have all the defense capabilities and where the people that are in that area need A, accountability, B, personal protective equipment, C, credentialing for accountability purposes, if there's something else going on. And that is a defensive area to where, your inner perimeter would have to be established. So again, if you were to look at the map and see where those blast sites were to be, you would have to think about how you hold that area for credentialing specifically, who gets out, who goes in, because this is a very heavily controlled point. And once you lose it, then you're losing all kinds of things. You're losing potential perpetrators and their information on them. You're losing witnesses. You might be losing evidence, again, as it relates to criminal investigations. Warm zone is the zone where if you do have contamination in this event and you're doing monitoring and you had an event like in a dirty war, this is where your decontamination happens. And that's where specialized units obviously would be working. And then the cold zone is where you establish all the facilities for the incident that, links directly to emergency management. So you would have your incident command post or field commands that would be outside of a warm area. Any media staging, any staging for resources and apparatus, like for Houston Fire, for example, and any other logistical resources. So certainly, dividing your incident geographically to identify what those areas in relation to the event are going to be would be very critical in managing it. And you want to do that quite early because, again, if you don't, then you don't have that tractability. Remember, the events can become intractable very quick. And so those initial actions are really crucial, and that should be a planning consideration. So I'm glad you talked about that. You talked about rehabilitation area. And what rehabilitation areas, maybe you didn't call it this way, but you talked about the area where the people can go if they are exhausted or have a suffering from the impact. There are emergency responders that have been working, long shifts. And so this rehabilitation area would have some respite for them and hopefully debriefing opportunities, because debriefing again in this event is going to be crucial for first responders. Mental health issues, PTSDs, and those psychological traumas do tend to occur in a magnified manner if those debriefings are not conducted at the end of each operational period. Oklahoma City, during Oklahoma City bombing, did an excellent job on not allowing first responders to go eat their supper until they actually went through peer debriefings. And, whether you use counseling or chaplaincy or whatever services that Daniel mentioned, it's going to be dictated by the event, certainly. But those debriefings are very crucial. In Katrina, I had talked to several responders that were there immediately after, and then another group that was there 6 weeks after. And the first groups that were working, providing emergency response support and restoration of lifelines were not being debriefed. And 4 or 5, 6 weeks after, the teams that were coming in, they had a very structured debriefing process for whatever activities they were conducting during the day. Dead animals, dead dogs, obviously casualties and victims in the water and decomposing bodies. That is not something that any normal person is used to generally dealing with. So those things are very crucial. So that second team and the first team and their accounts of their mental health issues posed were very different. So very, very immediate debriefings, mental debriefings are really crucial and would be crucial in an event like that. And certainly designating the areas and process how it would happen, like Oklahoma City did, is very, very important in the planning. Certainly, I think you talked about credentialing of people who should be there and how the credentialing would happen. In 9/11, the credentialing didn't happen until, several days into the short-term recovery efforts, and it was established by Secret Service in this huge enterprise to, when you have a large scene like that, what areas and what sectors should be accessible to whom. And that would be a huge part of emergency management, who to allow to go where. And you sort of talked about those issues. So I want to bring you out of that, the tactical looking at it from the scene perspective to emergency management, that creating those processes for credentialing is going to be very important. Very similar with evacuees from Katrina that were coming to Houston and getting off buses and going to other facilities here. How do you credential them and make sure that they're not bringing what they're not supposed to be bringing with them, and being able to track them and make sure that they get moved to the locations just for accountability, and so on. You talked about some agencies that would be involved, Fire Marshal's Office from Harris County, technical specialists, Environmental Protection Agency, or air monitoring, certainly. The biohazard, that's under the auspices of EPA. So in your immediate planning for response to that event, detection of anything in the air would be critical. You talked about special operation groups being brought in the immediate response. And in your planning session, bringing rodeo representatives, certainly a parade planning committee, walk-around planning committee would be involved. Just FYI, Foot Locker has a big part in credentialing of walkers and runners and how they are allowed to get into the race, and what they can bring with them, and the bracelets that they wear, whatever, where they leave their stuff, where they pick up their stuff. So that private sector and those entities that help coordinate those activities would be necessary. You mentioned the public information officer, again, function, and that in the Joint Information Center for Harris County is Francisco Sanchez, who is a main PIO, who has a build-up trust with the community and media community for Houston Emergency Center, which is a sort of a sister coordination entity, because in the city of Houston and in Harris County, you have those two entities, kind of like in Boston, when you looked at intelligence centers and the after action report, multiple intelligence center, the BRIG and the Fusion Center, and so on. Our Fusion Center in Houston is located in Houston Emergency Center, HEC, which is on Shepherd, and on Katy Road, there is a Harris County Office of Emergency Management, Homeland Security. So one entity is multi-agency coordination for the county, one entity is a multi-agency coordination for the city. Well, those do have to speak to one another in this event. So the coordination of camera feeds and those TransStar cameras and stuff like that would happen at that level as well. Certainly the mayor of the city sits at HEC. The judge for the county sits at Harris County Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. So again, you've got those city and county officials that are at that part of emergency management as well. And so media updates, staging, contacting papers for any releases, that's all going to happen out of Joint Information Center. Houston Emergency Center and Houston City of Houston has a PIO, lead PIO as well, but it's a new position. It's a new person, so I don't know who that is. They just had a hiring process for that person. But those people know one another, and they would be coordinating that message to the public and to the international community. Something about the international community, you did not mention at all, really, the federal level of response. Again, the Stafford Act, the Presidential Declaration of Disaster would all happen and be coordinated, at those emergency management levels. And certainly with Houston being a location of 30 plus consulates and dignitaries and diplomats from foreign countries, the national security nexus is really huge, and certainly diplomatic considerations are going to be in place for A, national security, B, information to all those international partners, ministries of foreign affairs of different countries, because there are going to be families of people affected that are not Houston residents. Those families might be coming to Houston. Those families might be needing updates from the medical centers and so on and so forth. So the State Department would play a huge role and be part of a joint field office, and also that coordinated response with local authorities. So when you think about the big picture of the management, the large management of the event happens at that multi-agency coordination level. So Catastrophic Medical Operations Center for Houston hospitals and area hospitals for medical surge. And CTRAC is another multi-agency coordination that exists in Houston. And certainly the emergency operations centers for the city, for the county, they would be all syncing. And that's eventually where the management of volunteers should take place. And conceptually, FEMA recommends volunteer reception points and creating those. In Harvey, that didn't happen. So obviously that problem persists. Volunteer management is not ideal in those large events, and that's probably a consideration for the future because it's a big portion of emergency management. Is how do you manage those volunteers? Aimee talked about, them having prerequisite skills not to become a liability. And I think that our attention and focus in planning for the future should focus on how do you leverage those resources that try to help in a response phase, because then that's when everything is so visible. And yet when you move to recovery, those resources are becoming scarce. So emergency management might take into consideration creating databases of people that came in and offered help, and educating them and explaining to them the importance of being part of emergency management from the civic participation perspective in the recovery phase, and sort of rechanneling that desire and the passion for help into a longer term process where now you have time for credentialing, special training, prepping them. Let's say, a lot of those volunteers would be assisting people with trying to fill out claims for FEMA or medical compensation claims and things like that. And training this type of volunteers for the recovery phase could sort of perhaps shift that spontaneous or impeding efforts of emergency responders by Good Samaritans to sort of channeling their passions for the longer term. Just the food for thought, this is a topic that's very dear to me. How do you embrace the emergence, and how do you make it self-sustaining in the long run, so you can leverage that properly. Of course, you talked about, I think Aimee talked a lot about being able to use technologies for modeling decision making for, if you had a disbursement, how would you leverage the technologies such as WebEOC, which actually Catastrophic Medical Operations Center uses for their situational awareness of, the surge capacity, they call it medical surge. So how many beds available and how you shifting those resources around in the region based on priorities. Okay, decision making. You talked about a little bit about organic or creative decision making, and you talked about Rudy Giuliani in 9/11. And I think that Rudy Giuliani is often cited as, having displayed really high levels of emotional intelligence during 9/11. And I mentioned emotional intelligence in the previous commentary to your Google Hangout too. So certainly here, emotions and the ability to manage emotions from the standpoint of the leadership is going to be critical, because that again links to this event that's going to be unprecedented, that it's unwitnessed, that it hasn't happened before. So, you know, one of those black swan events where creative decision making is going to have a huge part, because, you know, as complementing the other forms of decision making, and certainly the issue of operational periods, because of the trauma and the type of event that you picked. Emergency responders are going to be heavily emotionally impacted. So considerations for proper operational periods being shorter, perhaps in the immediate response, and then more longer as resources from federal government become available, overtime becomes available, and you can sort of have more time to manage resources. That's going to be very important as well. I want to refer you to the planning P in your week 3, where you have a sort of this ongoing incident action planning for different phases of a response and short-term recovery, at least, where on that planning P, those processes initially are going to happen within shorter frames, because operational periods are based on incident objectives. And certainly incident objectives initially are going to have to be accomplished within a short time frames. You know, there's a certain amount of time you have to get people out. There's a certain amount of time you have to dedicate to preserving the scene and assuring scene security. There's a certain amount of time you have to interview witnesses. There's a certain amount of time you have to route people or do the traffic plan. Once all that is accomplished and the scene is managed or contained at least, then you sort of move to incident objectives that are a little bit more long-term. So in the next, 2 days or 3 days, or, what's going to happen with, counseling and stuff like that, that's going to be more long-term. So as you move into the objectives for the event that are a little bit longer in time, then your operational periods are going to be longer, because they don't require quite as much of a mental stress and fatigue on the part of incident command, unified command, and all those coordinating structures. And certainly resources not available immediately. There's such a thing called the resource arch. So the resources are not available initially, then they go up, and everything comes to the event, and then you have a peak, and then you have to start thinking about demobilizing. As soon as you start demobilizing the resources, you also start thinking long-term for rotation and reassignments of people that have been at the event for too long, again, just to minimize the psychological impact in this particular scenario. So as far as the way you approached your event, I think that what I want you to think about is all those different structures that beyond first responders, that first responders might not even be aware of that fact, those things happening at different levels of government. There are different multi agency coordinating structures that eventually sort of take hold and coordinate that event, whereas the command and control happens in those zones and the incident command posts, and they're more of a tactical decision making and operational decision making, not as much as strategic decision making that happens at a much higher levels. So I thank you for your participation, Daniel. I hope that you are enjoying the East Coast. Really interesting perspectives that you bring from there. And I think that you were planning to plug in and talk to your group from Jersey Shores. So I'm very curious to listen to your last Google Hangout and see what you're going to share with them. But thank you for your collaboration on those previous 3 Hangouts. I enjoyed them, and I'll see you on the next one.